we would call adaptation. So what adaptation are those steps that humans would take to reduce the effects of climate change? And so first I worked quite a bit on what strategies are available in it for natural resource managers or conservation biologists or foresters to help species and ecosystems tolerate climate change. And so that we would say that's sort of people helping nature. That's one side of nature-related climate change adaptation. But actually, as I've been working on that for some period of time, it's also increasingly apparent, and there are other folks working on the opposite side, which is that nature actually has quite a lot of help to offer us in how we, human systems, need to adapt to climate change. So when we talk about the nature of adaptation, I like saying that phrase. The nature of adaptation is biodiversity, and by listening to and obeying and creatively using the tools of nature to help us adapt to climate change, and also our stewardship obligations to nature to help it adapt to climate change. Okay. And can I say one more thing about that?
Go ahead,
importantly, we cannot talk about adaptation for ourselves or for living creatures without saying that we really want that climate change to be small. Our chances of adapting to climate change are best when the amount of climate we're adjusting to is small. So that's another duality. We need to stop greenhouse gas emissions to get climate change under control and adapt to the climate that is changing.
Okay, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but just want to throw out like a future conversation maybe you and I can have is, as you were describing that, the definition of resilience. And if you like in the natural resource sector versus the built environment, but we don't necessarily need to go down the rabbit hole. But I'm curious, as you've been in this space for a while, in the natural resource sector, I feel was probably one of the early adopters, or even people really thinking about adaptation. And what's your opinion, or I guess what have you tracked? Have they, like, now that more of the built environment sector is thinking about adaptation, which is encouraging, are they talking about nature-based solutions very much? Are you seeing that, or is it still something we have to advocate more for?
Yeah, I definitely, that has been my experience, that ecologists, natural resource managers, foresters started, I don't know, maybe because climate is such an important determinant of biodiversity to begin with, where things live on Earth, how abundant they are, who interacts with what species are interacting with each other. Climate has a huge influence on that. So as soon as we start to imagine that the climate's going to change, ecologists and foresters and grassland managers or whatever start paying attention. So I do think that ecologists were kind of the early creative forces around adaptation. In the built environment, I mean, there have been other themes that have been evolving over some time. A lot of interest in, say, green space in the urban environment as a way for managing storm water or increasing water quality in the urban environment. And so that kind of green infrastructure world has also started to take on this flavor of adaptation. Oh, that's a tool that can be used to help humans deal with climate change, and that involves nature. So I think there's actually a sort of confluence of these different practices coming together. And as you alluded to with resilience, unfortunately, we do have these different words and terms that we use in different fields. You'll hear this idea of sort of a green infrastructure, or coming out of the engineering world. You'll hear talk about ecosystem services coming out of the ecology world. But we're all converging in a similar space, I think.
Okay, so this would probably help people kind of think about it. Normally when we think, we're going to help nature adapt to climate change, that's a tall order. Maybe that's even a bit arrogant, but like, bring that down to scale. What does that really mean to help nature adapt to climate change?
Well, at first, I think you have a great point. When we say we're going to help nature adjust to changing conditions, that's to the best of our ability. And that's why I think it's so important to point out that we want to keep climate change small, because we cannot assume that we have the knowledge, the resources, the time, to actually effectively manage systems worldwide, that we will do a good job of conserving biodiversity. I think that's probably not on the table. But there are many things that we can do to facilitate change that nature sort of needs to go through in order to reduce the effects of climate change. We'll probably tend to prioritize those from what we're interested in, because we're the ones taking action. So things that we do, for example, to make sure that we have healthy forests for timber production, or we might prioritize conservation actions for species that are already endangered, or other kinds of ecosystem services, or things that have value to us. I guess my biggest fear is, I often think about, as an ecologist, I think about global biodiversity. Actually, one of my main goals would be to try to save as many species on Earth, to preserve the richness of life to the best of our ability. That may be a bit of a lofty goal, but there are lots of local systems and places and organisms that we could, and objectives that we can do quite a lot to maintain.
So, but I guess maybe you can give an example of something different. I don't know if you followed, are you familiar with the Wildlife Conservation Society has an adaptation fund? Are you familiar with their work? So
yeah,
I was early on, I know Molly Cross, she's been involved with that for a while. And to their credit, they've been really early. I think they've been around 10 years funding projects. And so, but I haven't kept track enough that these are really small scale projects. And I wonder what your opinion is. Like, what are they doing?
So Molly and I actually started talking about this. She was one of a long time ago, because one of the questions was, what adaptation actions would WCS support? Like, what kinds of stuff should qualify? And this has been a really evolving and changing argument, if you will, in our field about what are good actions that everyone thinks, oh, that has a lot of positive side effects, or that would be a good idea anyway. But there are some other adaptation strategies that are a little bit more contentious, or they could have more negative side effects, or they're not things that we're used to doing. So initially that fund, if I remember correctly, was focused on what we might call those sort of win-win solutions, where they were doing things that were helpful under climate change, but not using a lot of tools that were outside of the traditional toolbox of conservation biology. But I think they've really come a long way, and are now pursuing much more active management, things that look much more interventionist. So, I do believe they tend to focus on the relatively small scale. It's sort of easier at that more local scale, is where you can imagine defining, like, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the tools available to achieve that goal, and apply it I guess that's one of the concerns about global biodiversity, is if you stitch all those individual actions together, are they going to be enough to preserve life on Earth? Maybe not, but.
It's coming back to me now. I was a reviewer on some of the grants, I think, for a couple of years, but it's been a while. And so you'd get like a small environmental organization, conservation organization. Maybe they're working with beavers or something like that. It's a water management project. And so, like, parsing out what really is the unique original adaptation aspect of this, they were kind of struggling with early on, and I think they've gotten much more sophisticated. I should probably have Molly on do an interview here to get kind of a catch up. But I wonder what you think is, I don't want to mention the organization's group, and it's not WCS, but I was exposed to, it was a big conservation organization, and they had an adaptation shop doing adaptation and trying to bring that within the organization. And they had a lot of trouble with this. And I had this trouble when I was even working for the state of Florida. Is like the traditional conservationists, whatever that might mean, they're like, well, why am I doing adaptation? And so I found that really interesting, that this person at this big organization was struggling to try to get all these other people on the ground to but to me, being a conservationist and an adaptation should be one and the same now. There should be no daylight between the two. But
now to manage in the face of climate change is just part of natural resource management. But that's in large part because the climate is changing, right? This is not a hypothetical, what are we willing to do in the future? This is climate regimes are shifting underneath us, as we speak. So you can't really you can't manage a forest or a grassland or a wetland or a urban park without thinking at least now, climate extremes being more frequent than they were historically. I do think when we first started talking in the natural resource space about adaptation, that was a very common sentiment. People saying, I'm busy. I'm already dealing with endangered species. I'm doing invasive species control. I have development pressures. My budgets are limited. And now you're going to come along and say, I have to do more and extra stuff because of climate change. I think that's passed because the hopeful thinking that we could just sort of ignore that and just keep doing what we've been doing before, that ship has long since sailed. But I also think we're much more sophisticated now that we realize that when we are managing for climate, we are also managing for endangered species and invasive species and timber production and all these other things that were important before. We just need to think about how we achieve them. We have new factors that we have to take into consideration. And when we were talking about sort of our evolving toolbox, there were some practices in particular that were very controversial from the beginning, one of which being actively moving species around, or for that matter, a number of things that were more interventionist, like we're going to burn more frequently than we have before, or we're actually going to facilitate and promote the system changing from the thing it was historically into something else, or we're going to start embracing a different suite of species in this location than we would have in the past. So those things, when they start to look different or are different approaches than we would have taken before, that's when that's another time that conservation biology kind of got nervous. Moving things around is something that we were taught you don't do. That's how you get invasive species. But now under a climate change scenario, we're talking about moving things around again. How to navigate and balance the pros and cons of that, well, that's what I was suggesting is one of those sort of knowledge questions we actually have to figure out.
Well, maybe you could give us an example, managed relocation, and I know there's different terms, but is there a particular species that maybe has been relocated or they're really talking about this? I mean, I don't know. We talked about the key deer, but I don't know if you have a better example that you think would be useful to explain.
Yeah, it's an evolving, it's going to be different for different kinds of species. Frankly, the rules are different for different types of organisms. What are you even allowed to move, for example, across state lines, or, the rules for plants are different for animals, certainly different for endangered species. You can't just go pick up your favorite endangered species and put it in a different spot. There are experiments ongoing for timber or for tree species. I personally would expect if I could glance into the future, I would expect most of our managed relocation to be associated with that kind of highly managed system where there's an economic value. So that's kind of already further down the path. You also are starting to see federal and state agencies developing plans or at least criteria. I was part of a recent discussion and actually a workbook that will be forthcoming for the National Park Service. So the service is actually saying, okay, well, what could this look like for us? Not that they're doing it at the moment, but they're beginning to say, under what conditions would we begin to prioritize or at least be open to this as a strategy? So there aren't a lot of standing examples out there, but we've moved from sort of rhetoric, we're starting to get into practical application.
I think it's happening in your neck of the woods, and if not, I mean, I think TN Nature Conservancy is doing a tree experiment. Yeah. I think in Minnesota or either Wisconsin.
Yes, yeah.
Well, maybe you could we're going to plant these trees that aren't traditionally here, but let's see how they do. Could you maybe give a little bit of background on that?
Yes, my colleague, and actually she directs the Institute on the Environment on our Duluth campus, Julie Ederson and colleagues, together with some folks at the Nature Conservancy, has been conducting an experiment. So in northern Minnesota, in fact, across the upper Midwest, is one of those places that you'd expect to have a lot of biodiversity change, because the sort of temperate eastern forest comes and finds its northern boundary, and then you have the northern forest, or the sort of boreal forest, they come in contact. And those contact zones are where you'd expect to see the most change, that you would shift from sort of one biome to another. And you're already beginning to see in northern Minnesota, along the north shore of Lake Superior, some changes in what trees are doing well. Some of the more northerly species are tending to fare less well, and that would suggest that some of these more southerly species would and could push into those areas. And where you need to solidify the banks of the shore to prevent erosion or other kinds of ecosystem services, we want healthy forests there. And so they're beginning to test how successful some of these more southerly species would be in those areas. I just think that's really a smart way of doing that, to approach. We want these kinds of experiments, and we want science and research, and we want scholars working with practitioners thinking about these ideas before someone just goes out and implements a program, an official program, if you will, or even takes action of their own accord.
Okay, when it comes to nature-based solutions, I guess I want to talk more broadly about, some bigger attempts to do this. And, I guess conservation groups, environmental groups are advocating for these things, but, there's a lot of pieces at play, and, even infrastructure spending, and, what is likely to be maybe the broader uses of nature-based solutions? I guess flooding would be an area.
So what do we mean when we say nature-based solutions? We are referring to the sort of social and economic goods, usually for people, that can come from incorporating or mimicking a natural solution. And so adapting to climate change is one special category of nature-based solutions. So we could also use nature-based solutions to, say, clean water before it runs to the river in an urban setting. But using nature to help adapt to climate change would include things like including green space in our cities to reduce heat under extreme temperature events, or that cleaning of water, recognizing that we're going to have bigger storm events. And then also we can use nature to help reduce climate change itself by sequestering carbon and storing it in soils or in plant material, for example. And so there have been studies out there that maybe as much as a fifth, 20% of US annual emissions could be sequestered or could be accounted for with these nature-based solutions. In the urban environment, we've done some studies showing that if you use green roofs and you could reduce daytime heat in the hottest days, which will directly confer. We did some studies in Chicago on this, which translates directly into illness and mortality, and also building energy demand. So those are some examples. Now you'll do those when they're cost effective. Actually mitigating extreme heat, where we're talking about lives and people in the hospital and demand on energy supplies, that actually could be a very good economic argument. Another great economic argument is using nature solutions for that storminess under climate change, where your alternative is digging up the street and putting in bigger pipes, which is really, really expensive. So I think usually when the alternative is either very costly or the consequences are really high, that's when nature-based solutions are really going to win out. That's where they'll win first. And then you pile on top of that all the side benefits that we get from those nature solutions, recreation, these kinds of things. That can help tip the scales too.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end of the episode, and I got a couple more questions though, and I want to get a question from the community room. But in my favorite nature-based solution, I'm from Florida originally, and just mangrove forests.
Mangroves.
Yes. Sea level rise, like if you're making sure you're keeping those intact, it might actually give you some soil accretion too. It's buying you. It's not going to, I don't think, buy you for 6-7 feet of sea level rise, but it's buying you some time, and it's use more of it. So it's one of my favorites.
Well, and it will help for right, those studies sea level rise, but sea level rise is a relatively slow process. What will happen first will be storms and storm surge. and it can play a big role. I mean, actually, there are really amazing data coming out of the big tsunamis showing that areas that had mangrove forest in front of them when the water came fared much better. The people on land fared much better than areas where those mangrove forests had been removed. So
we actually have some people from Bangladesh on our team here at Simpatico, and I asked, because they have that this famous mangrove forest there where a lot of people live too. So it's, I think, been very helpful. All right, here's a question for Mike. Do you think that as we reevaluate infrastructure planning for energy production, that this in turn will also incorporate concern and effort for species surrounding these projects, i.e. solar is far less invasive or harmful than, say, hydroelectric or coal?
One of the things I'm most excited about in the Midwest, and we actually have a paper coming out on this soon. All scientists have a paper coming out on something soon, right? This is our favorite phrase. On solar, utility scale solar in the Midwest. So if you think about what is the habitat, in fact, it's one of the most endangered habitats in the entire planet, are North American native prairie. And similarly wetlands in the agricultural, they were taken out for agriculture. That land was more valuable for food production. Now, as utility scale solar is coming online, those systems are coming. There's the possibility of restoring grassland underneath them.
Wow.
And we've done some studies to compare, just back of the envelope calculations about the pollinator populations that you can sustain, the carbon that you can store, and the sort of the extent to which we could restore the prairie. We took the prairie out for agriculture. Now we're going to grow electrons, and we may be able to put the prairie back in. I think that's a pretty cool story about taking advantage of a new technology to advance some of our ongoing conservation interests. And it'll have economic benefits and climate change mitigation benefits too.
All right, this is an ecosystem restoration, but here I moved to Tucson, and what a lot of schools have are just big, broad solar panels arrays, and underneath it's shaded, and that's where the kids play. That's their playground in the really hot summer. It's like, all right, there's a lot of stuff you could do underneath that.
Grazing livestock. Yeah, there's another one for,
Well, you know what? We have to wrap this up. So, I think there's other conversations. I hope we can get you back and have more conversations. But just, I guess what's next for you? What's on your plate for 2021?
Well, I am interested, and we're still working on this question about what's the relationship between increasing solar deployment and conservation. I'm also working on we're working on some methane work. Where is methane emissions coming from, and what can we do to stop some of those emissions? That's both in the oil and gas sector and in agriculture. And I keep working. I always have a butterfly that I'm studying, and always working on endangered species conservation with students. So I'm doing that as well. So we're working on both sides. How do we stop climate change from being terrible? How do we prosper from the economy that emerges associated with green energy? And also, what are we going to do to confront the climate changes that are here already and coming more?
Indeed. Well, I'm glad you guys are on the job. So thank you, Jessica, for coming on. And I want you to hold on. I'm going to take you into just chatting before I let you go. But thanks for coming on Simpatico and sharing the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Doug.
Right back. Okay, we just like to close out the episode. Yeah, that was great. Time flew by, it does. It's fast, but it's an interesting topic. So how many graduate students do you work with? What's your lab like?
It's pretty small because I have these other administrative responsibilities, but I have 2 grad students and a postdoc now. One grad student is actually working on, so if we think about moving species around, another idea is moving genes around.
Oh.
So this is a prairie conservation project, but she's studying whether or not it would help native populations flourish under climate change if you took more southerly genotypes and introduced them into some of these native populations. So it's not putting new species in new places, but it's putting new genetic stock, if you will, in new places. And then my other student is working on this endangered butterfly that we're still kind of thinking about could be a candidate for managed relocation, and some modeling work there.
So I have to ask, I mean, your advisor at Stanford was Paul Ehrlich. He wrote The Population Bomb. I've got this right. I'm just curious, are you still in contact with them? Do you still, and the population bomb and all that conversation from the 70s has just been used over and over again as like bad predictions and all. And I'm not challenging the premise in the book, but does that come up? I'm just curious. You know, it must be an interesting thing for him to see how it's become almost part of popular culture.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't actually asked him that question lately. It seems that the criticism has been particularly, it's sort of intensified here in the last couple of years.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, in this way, and I think actually Paul would, I can't speak for Paul, but I think he would agree with this. He was sounding the alarm. I don't think he was wrong. I mean, I think the effects that he was wrong in some respects, that it wasn't population per se. It wasn't that we're all starving now because there are too many of us, but we have greenhouse gas we have climate change, and we have nutrient pollution. We have all these environmental problems that are a function of the scale of the human enterprise. So, and Paul would acknowledge that now that population is only part of that. And really, what we can see from climate change is that it is affluence that is equally, if not more important. I think so if he were to start over again now, he would write a lot about affluence. And then I think, this emphasis on fertility, and that was probably racist. Like now we would say that we're a little bit more thoughtful, and we would talk about sustainable development, and we would talk about sending girls to school, and these other important and we would talk about empowering communities to make decisions for themselves, because they almost always make good ones.
Yeah, and
so we would just approach it differently now. And but I think the fundamental point is still salient. I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I have affection for him too.
No, I'm coming this more neutral. It's more, I was just curious. He's a famous scientist, and it's population bomb, and I would love to just have a cocktail hour with the guy. Just be like, I would have really just enjoyed having that conversation. And it's been interesting. People, let's say on the right, oh, look what they said about the population. That's not very helpful. But it's been interesting how it's been debated and talked about in environmental circles, and just like, well, you were wrong there and this. And in regards to climate change, I rarely hear about population being a solution. Occasionally it comes up, and I have a podcast too where I talk about it and adaptation, and that no one ever brings up population as like the issue. And so I just find that interesting. Like, I think
that is, it comes up frequently giving public talks, or at least for me, it comes up frequently when I give public talks. Usually, someone will say, well, isn't the problem that we have too many people? And I don't dispute that yes, having a lot of people has a lot of impact. But when you look specifically at greenhouse gas emissions, if you were to grab a random greenhouse gas emission or greenhouse gas molecule in the atmosphere and say, where did this come from? It didn't come from all the people in Africa, right? It came from somebody's SUV in Minnesota, right? So it's less that population isn't a concern, especially when we think about refugees and people who are going to be fleeing, who are going to be suffering the consequences of climate change. Their experiences of climate change are going to be very much influenced by population. But it's not population that's responsible for the vast majority of greenhouse gases that are currently in the atmosphere. That's affluence.
And I've spoken, and if I get that question, if I take the debate at all, what I'll say is, well, we're having too many Americans or something like that. Right. It's like, if we want to do population control, maybe.
I think that's right. Too many Americans.
Yeah, that'll be our solution, not,
And
attacking other
on
countries.
on the subject of Paul, the other Ehrlich, the Paul also that I know, because I wasn't a student of his during the era of the population bomb, Paul is an ecologist and a lepidopterist, and that's what I learned from him. Is I learned how to engage in science policy and how to be a scientist talking to the public. And Paul always felt that that was important, and he was never intimidated by other science colleagues telling him that he shouldn't be doing that, which there are a lot of people who still feel that way. And so I never learned to listen to those people either. But I learned population biology from him. I learned how to swing a butterfly net. I learned how to so a lot of people don't know that about him, but all the work that he has done on plants, butterfly coevolution, and so that's actually the side that I was trained under, was the ecology, population biology, Paul.
Well, one of my highlights on Twitter is when I used to work at the Society for Conservation Biology. I had a Twitter account there, and he followed me. I'm like, oh, cool. He's a famous scientist. All right, just before I let you go, Sarah asks in the community, what was the butterfly? What's the butterfly you're working on?
Oh, the Karner. Well, right now it's the Karner blue butterfly, which is a federally listed endangered species here in the Midwest and also in parts of New England. So it's a good species. Well, it's an important species to study regardless, but it's an interesting climate. The reason why actually butterflies in general are great to study under climate change is because they're very sensitive to temperature. And the Karner blue butterfly hardly flies anywhere. So we've done this, I think I maybe shared with your production team, done some mapping showing where the climate tolerances of this butterfly would be in the future. And it's hundreds and hundreds of miles from its historic areas of occupancy within the next couple of decades. So how is this little butterfly going to go from here to there? It's just, it invites questions about, it's going to need help, whether it's ways in which we manage its habitat. We've even talked about, you could irrigate it has a problem where it kind of gets dried, the habitat gets dried out under a climate scenario. So you could irrigate, you could move it. You and I were talking about triage. I would never advocate that for my precious species, but I don't know, maybe it's not maybe it will take too much effort to be able to conserve it under climate change too.
Sarah quickly found a link and is sharing a photo of it. It's beautiful. It has some yellow stripes at the bottom, right? Does that sound right? It's kind of a purple.
The Karner blue butterfly? Yeah, it's kind of a purpley gray. Yeah.
She's sharing it in the chat here. Well, we include you get a whole page for your episode, so we'll include a link to that just so someone can see the butterfly when they come to your episode. Well, I'm going to let you go. This has been fantastic, and like I said, this is a learning platform too, and I'd love to have that resilience conversation with you. I'd love to pick your brain like that. I went to a WWF event. Whole thing was a TED Talk on resilience, and by 10:30 in the morning, we already had 6 different definitions of resilience, and I'm like, what's going on here? So love to get your opinion on that.
Well, yeah, and you and I, we were talking about this, how that term, were we talking about this? How that term is used in different settings and means different, also in the ecology community versus in the human development space. And when you were saying, we wrote a little public-facing article several years ago saying that actually ecologists are thinking about moving stuff, right? Facilitating corridors, actually helping species move. And for the most part, in the human sort of migrant refugee space, they're trying to make sure that people, moving is a really scary thing. And so when we say resilience, it's in large part to maybe reduce migration. So when that community is now starting to confront that human migration is likely to be a major force, and I think ecologists, all the thinking that we've done about movement and facilitation of movement and being open to movement is maybe something that could benefit. That crosstalk could be beneficial over in that entirely different community of people.
And just even the federal government, my experience is they look at resilience, especially with communities. It's just climate proofing them in the face of climate change, and that's very dangerous kind of, expectations. They might have to transition, they might have to move, and so when you give that impression like we're going to climate proof you, that's sending the wrong message, and that's how a lot of people are using resilience. So it's interesting, and it's not just a semantics thing, it's actually what it means for policies on the ground.
And also, right, and what you're trying to actually achieve.
Yeah.
What is the goal here? To try to keep it the same or facilitate change.
See, there we go. We could go another 30 minutes with this. We'll just go with this episode will be available probably hopefully in the next few days. And please do share. You could download it from Simpatico, but if you have a YouTube channel for the Institute or something, maybe you feel like it's, hey, learn about some of the work that I'm doing. Hopefully you can share it that way. And we'll be sharing it on social media in the coming weeks too.
Sounds good. So you were also talking about Molly and other folks. I mean, anybody I can help with. I mean, I know Molly, but anybody that I might know that you don't know.
No. Please do. Like, we'll follow up. Like, we'll send you an email to say if there's some names and such. Yeah, like we reach out to folks, sort of like we reached out to you, and especially if there's topics that we're kind of thematically, we're trying to follow up through on some ideas and such. So
I do actually think we didn't talk about this wetland stuff, but I actually think just like the solar having native prairie restoration, this idea that across large areas where wetlands were destroyed, there's new motivation because of climate change to put wetlands back in. That I think is also really interesting. There's some hydrologists. I would direct you to the one that I worked with who has some interesting things to say about that.
And that reminds me that 2021, we're going to focus, like there's days, like International Wetland Day, there's days for this. Mm-hmm. So we want to try to align with what we're doing on Simpatico with those days. And so maybe you have some ideas about those topics, because a lot of them will be environmentally themed days. So yeah, that'd be great.
Super.
Okay, cool. Well, you can just sign out of StreamYard, but thank you so much again for your time. This has been great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fun. I enjoyed talking to you.
Okay, take care. We'll be in touch.
Bye.
Okay, folks, I think I'm going to sign off. I think originally we were going to have, I don't think Lisa is there. So we're going to have another person participating, just chatting, but we've got Mike. Let me look at the schedule real quick. Mike his topic is story pirates, change makers, giving back over Zoom. That's an interesting series of words together that Mike always has a nice eclectic lineup of the people that he talks to. And then even later on, we have Lee, 2 episodes, Better Futures Australia, how health sector groups are engaging with the climate action agenda, and then decolonization and climate justice in Australia, Dejara Delani. Oh, wow. What a full day, guys. All right. We will talk to you later.